The dress arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried up 3 flights of stairs by the youngest of the housemaids, and set across the bed in Miss Cecily Vane's small room without ceremony. It was a morning gown, black silk that had seen better seasons, its hem carefully unstitched and restitched by someone who had wanted to add length to it without disturbing the original construction. The card that accompanied it bore no signature. It said only that she should contribute something suitable for a lady of standing, should she wish to help with the charity sale. Cecily knew what it meant. She was the 4th companion Lady Alderton had engaged in as many years, and she had lasted 7 months. That was longer than the others. She had learned, in those 7 months, to keep her face composed when Lady Alderton spoke to her as one addresses a table, to answer questions she had not been asked, to be useful without being noticed. She had not yet learned indifference to the small cruelties. She suspected she never would. She picked up the gown and began to fold it for the sale, smoothing the bodice flat, running her fingers along the seam at the hip where the old stitching showed through. It was there, between the outer silk and the inner lining, that she felt it. Not a seam, something folded, something deliberate. She held still for a moment. Then she drew the gown to the window where the October light came through the gauze, and she found the opening, the 4 stitches that had been taken wide apart, that had been meant to be found, and she drew out the paper. The note was short. The ink had browned with age, but the hand was clear. A woman's hand. Careful and unhurried. It said that if she was reading this, she was already inside Alderton House, and she would know, as the writer had known, that there was no safe way to say it aloud. The man responsible for the first Duchess has a name. It is Holt. He still serves there. Do not drink the tisane he sends up on cold nights. Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it inside the bodice of her own dress, flat against her ribs, where it pressed like a second heartbeat. She did not know the name of the first Duchess. She did not know when she had died. She knew the Duke of Alderton was in residence, had been in residence for 3 weeks now, after 2 years of what the household called his travels. Though the word was spoken in the particular register of the household, that meant something harder than holidays. She knew she had seen him twice. Once at the foot of the stairs, where he had passed her without remark. Once in the library doorway at dawn, when she had not known he was there, and he had turned at the sound of her step and looked at her for the length of a full breath before continuing on his way. His face had the quality of stone that has been left in rain. Not cold, exactly. Something more like weight. She had not thought about him since. She thought about him now. The charity sale was that afternoon, and Cecily went down with the gown over her arm and the note against her skin, and a question she could not yet answer, sitting at the center of her chest, like a coal not yet caught. Lady Alderton received her in the drawing-room with the practiced disinterest of a woman who employs someone only to have them available for mild performances. She was seated between her daughter Margot, who had Alderton eyes without Alderton restraint, and a woman Cecily had not seen before, introduced as Mrs. Pemberton, a widow of the neighboring estate, whose arrival had been anticipated for some days with a kind of careful stage management Cecily recognized as preparation. "The gown will fetch very little," Lady Alderton said, taking the dress from Cecily's arm without looking at her. "Miss Vane has limited eye for value. She is, after all, a clergyman's daughter." Cecily said nothing. She had learned that silence was the period at the end of those sentences that Lady Alderton preferred not to have answered. Mrs. Pemberton glanced at her with what appeared to be sympathy, and then looked away. The sale was held in the long gallery. Cecily arranged items on the tables and kept a record in the estate ledger, and answered questions from the local ladies who came with their maids and their coin purses, and their assessments of each other's choices. She was useful and invisible in equal measure, which was the condition she had come to understand as her natural state in this house. It was near 3 o'clock when she became aware that the Duke had come into the gallery. He had not announced himself. He simply occupied the space, in the way that very tall men in very dark coats occupy spaces, which is to say completely, and she registered his presence before she had turned to confirm it, through some body-level alert she could not have named. The gallery stilled marginally. Lady Alderton straightened. Mrs. Pemberton arranged her expression into something more deliberate. He was looking at the ledger in Cecily's hands. "Is the accounting accurate?" he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I have kept a separate column for items donated without provenance so that the final tally can be divided properly." He looked at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. "Bring it to the study when the sale closes," he said, and he turned and left the gallery. And Cecily stood with her pulse in her throat, and the note against her ribs, and the absolute conviction that she was about to do something she could not undo. If you have ever stood with the truth in your hands and understood that carrying it further changes you permanently, you will know what Cecily felt in the gallery that afternoon. Stay with her. The study was at the end of the eastern corridor, past the portrait room and the closed door of what the housekeeper called the green parlor, in a voice that discouraged questions. The house had a grammar of silences, certain rooms spoken of in lower tones, certain passages taken by the staff at a pace that was slightly faster than the rest. Cecily had catalogued these silences without knowing what to do with them. She was beginning to understand. She knocked at the study door and heard him say, "Come in," and she entered. The Duke of Alderton was standing at the window, not seated behind his desk as she had expected, but standing with one hand on the sill and his face in profile against the gray afternoon. And the quality of his stillness was such that she had the sensation of entering a room that had been holding its breath for a long time. She set the ledger on the desk. "Thank you," he said without turning. "You may leave it." She did not leave. He turned then. He turned. He looked at her, and she saw for the first time clearly what his face contained. There was the stone she had first registered, yes. But beneath the stone, there was something she recognized, because she had spent 7 months learning to recognize it in her own mirror. Exhaustion, not the bodily kind. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy in a way that must not show. Was there something else? He said. She reached into her bodice and drew out the note. She placed it on the desk beside the ledger. He looked at it. He did not move. The stillness had changed quality, had gone from held breath to something else, something harder. "Where did this come from?" he said, his voice perfectly level. "It was sewn into the hem of a morning gown," she said. "It was sent to my room this morning as a donation for the charity sale." He picked up the note. He read it. The muscle along his jaw contracted once, which was the only outward signal she could read. He set the note down. "Who sent the gown?" he said. "There was no signature, only a card from Lady Alderton's household." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What is your name?" "Cecily Vane, Your Grace." "Miss Vane?" He said it as though testing the weight of it. "How long have you been in this house?" 7 months. "And before this house?" "I was employed as a governess in Devonshire for 2 years before my charge was sent to school. Before that, I kept my father's household." He was a clergyman in Dorset. He died 4 years ago. She did not know why she had said all of that. She had not intended to. Something in the quality of his attention had produced it. The way light through a window produces specific warmth and not another kind. He looked at the note again. He said, "You understand what this says? Yes? You came to me with it instead of burning it? Yes. Why?" She thought about that. "Because I believe it is true," she said, "and because a woman went to some trouble to make certain it was found." Something shifted in his face. It was not quite expression. It was more like the change in a landscape when a cloud moves off it. "Sit down," he said. The fire was lit, and she sat in the chair beside it, and he sat across from her, not behind his desk, which surprised her. And he asked her to tell him everything she had noticed in the 7 months she had been in the house. She told him. She was precise and chronological, and she left out nothing. He listened without interrupting, his hand still in his lap, and the fire moved behind the grate, and the light shifted on the walls. When she had finished, he said, "My first wife died of a fever." That was the verdict. "Yes," she said. She had been in perfect health the week before. The coal in her chest had become something more, a heat she could not account for. She said nothing. "There was an inquiry," he said. "The physician was satisfied. Holt gave his account. Everyone gave their account." He stopped. He looked at the fire. "I gave mine. You believed it. I needed to believe it." He said it quietly. "There is a difference." She understood that difference. She had lived inside it herself, the specific architecture of necessary belief. She did not say so. He picked up the note again. He held it by one corner, like a thing that had weight beyond its paper. She was called Emmeline. She had been married to me for 14 months. He set the note down with a care that was almost tenderness. She laughed at the wrong moments, which she knew, and she could not stop, which she also knew. And she thought it was a defect, and I thought it was the most honest thing about her. His voice had not changed register. That made it worse, somehow. I have not laughed since her death. I had not noticed that until this moment. Cecily was quiet. He looked at her. The full quality of his attention was a particular kind of weight, and she had not been prepared for it. She had been, for 7 months, a piece of furniture. "You will say nothing of this to anyone in this house," he said. "I need time." "Of course. If Holt speaks to you privately, you will tell me immediately." "Yes." "If the tisane comes, you will not drink it." I had already decided that. He almost smiled. It did not quite complete itself. It was the ghost of a smile, the shape of one without the weight, and she thought it was one of the saddest things she had ever seen, and also one of the most beautiful, in the way that ruins are beautiful, because they tell you something was there. The following days moved differently. That is the only way Cecily could describe it. The house had the same grammar and the same silences. Holt still moved through it with his particular air of careful management. Lady Alderton still addressed Cecily as one addresses a table. Mrs. Pemberton was still being stage-managed toward the Duke with a patience that had begun to develop an edge. But something had shifted. Cecily felt it in the quality of her own attention, which was sharper and more directed, and in the way the Duke, when he passed her in the corridor or the hall, looked at her in a way that was not quite the way one looks at furniture. She paid attention to Holt. He was a man of perhaps 55, organized in his movements, careful with his words. He had served at Alderton House for 20 years. He had been there when Emmeline died. He had been there when the inquiry was closed. He moved through the house with the confidence of a man who had been tested and found safe. On the third day after her conversation with the Duke, Cecily was in the library cataloging a set of maps that needed to be assessed for the estate records, and Holt came in. "Miss Vane," he said. He was pleasant. He was always pleasant. "I wondered if you had settled in. The autumn drafts in this wing can be difficult." "I manage well enough," she said. "I have taken the liberty of noting that you do not take the evening tisane that I prepare for the household. Chamomile and a little valerian. It is quite safe. It helps with the cold." Her hands remained steady on the map. "I sleep without difficulty," she said. "Thank you for your concern." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not read, and then he said, "You are not what one might expect in a companion." And he left. She went to the Duke that evening. She told him what Holt had said. He listened with his face very still, and then he said, "Sit down." Again. And she did. And he stood at the window, and she watched the shape of him against the dark glass, and understood that he was thinking through something complicated. "There is a woman in the village," he said at last. "She was Emmeline's maid before she married and left service. I believed she had moved to her husband's family in Yorkshire. I have now learned she has been in the village for 3 years. He turned from the window. "I would like you to speak with her. I cannot go myself. A duke calling on a farmer's wife generates more interest than I can afford at present." "You trust me with this," Cecily said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. It was brief and without ornament, and she felt it in her chest like a key turning. She went to the village on the pretext of an errand the following morning, and she found the woman whose name was now Mrs. Joss Farrow. And she sat in her kitchen, and she listened, and what she heard was the following. On the night Emmeline fell ill, Holt had brought the evening tisane himself, which was not his usual practice, that the maid had noted it and thought nothing of it, that Emmeline had drunk it and been sick within the hour, and that the maid had told the physician this, and the physician had said, "Fever is fever," and had sent her from the room. She had told no one else. She had been young and frightened, and she had understood, in the way that young, frightened women in large houses understand things, that the people with the authority to act were the same people whose interests were served by the verdict of fever. Cecily thanked her. She walked back across the fields in the October wind, with the information sitting in her like a stone in water, dense and cold. What Cecily did not yet know, though she would learn it before the week was out, was that the Steward Holt had a brother. The brother was a solicitor in London who had managed, through a sequence of small reframings, to position himself as the administrator of a trust that had been Emmeline's own, established by her father before the marriage, a trust that had reverted on her death without children to the administrator's management. £20,000, managed by Holt's brother, for 4 years. She did not know this yet. She walked back across the fields, and she thought about Emmeline, who had laughed at the wrong moments and could not stop. And she thought about the Duke, who had not laughed since. And she thought about 7 months of being at table. And she thought about the note between 2 layers of silk. The woman who had sewed it there with enough composure to make sure the stitches were wide enough to find. She thought about the woman who had sewn the note, who had wanted the truth to outlive the telling. At dinner that evening, she was seated below the salt as usual, which meant she was adjacent to a young clergyman invited by Lady Alderton, and she had to hear Lady Alderton say to Mrs. Pemberton, at a volume calibrated to carry, that poor Miss Vane does very well for a clergyman's daughter. One must make allowances, and she had to eat her soup and look at nothing, and know that the note was in the Duke's desk drawer, and that 2 days ago she had been addressed directly by the most senior man in this house and asked to sit in the good chair by the fire. The clergyman made a remark about the October weather. She answered him with perfect courtesy. The Duke was at the head of the table. He did not look at her directly. But once, when the candles shifted in a draught from the door, she looked up and found that he had already been looking at her and looked away. And the fact that he had been looking and she had been looked at landed in her body like light in a locked room. She set down her fork. She was not yet sure what she was doing here, in this house, with this note, with this man who carried his grief like a coat that had never been taken off. She was sure she was not going to walk away from it. It was Lady Alderton who precipitated the crisis, as she precipitated most crises, through the management of other people's situations on behalf of her own interests. She had spent 3 weeks managing Mrs. Pemberton's proximity to the Duke. She had spent those same 3 weeks watching Cecily with a particular quality of attention that Cecily had initially read as ordinary surveillance and now understood to be something sharper. On a Thursday evening, with the house full of guests for a dinner Lady Alderton had organized with military precision, she said to the Duke in the drawing-room before the meal, in the hearing of 11 people, including the visiting magistrate Sir Crispin Reeve and the vicar Mr. Donoghue, and the assembled weight of local society, "I have had cause to wonder whether Miss Vane is entirely suited to a household such as this one. She has been, I fear, something of a disruptive presence." The room tilted. Cecily felt it tilt. She was standing near the window with a glass of water she had not drunk, and she kept her face composed and her eyes on the middle distance. "In what way disruptive?" the Duke said. His voice was even. "She takes a great deal upon herself," Lady Alderton said. "Permissions she has not been given. Freedoms she has not earned. One finds her in rooms where she has no cause to be." "You mean the library?" the Duke said. "Among other places. I sent her to the library." Lady Alderton paused for the length of a breath. "There are other rooms," she said. She had the skill of a woman who has been managing social services for 40 years, which is to say she kept her voice perfectly pleasant, and she let the implication do the work. The room had the specific quality of silence that is the sound of 11 people deciding which direction to look. The Duke set down his glass. It was a small movement, and it was complete. He said, "Miss Vane has been assisting me with a matter connected to the estate." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She has done so at my direct request, with precision and discretion. I would be grateful, Lady Alderton, if you would confine your assessments to those areas where you have accurate information." Lady Alderton's fan, which had been moving in its measured rhythm, went still. The vicar, Mr. Donoghue, said something about the excellent fire in the grate. Sir Crispin Reeve agreed that the evenings had turned. Mrs. Pemberton looked at her hands. Cecily lowered her glass of water and breathed. It was not the reversal yet. She did not know it was coming. She was managing the event of having been defended in a drawing-room before 11 people, which was the most public thing that had happened to her in 7 months. And she was doing this by keeping her eyes on the fire and her hands relaxed and her face at its ordinary register. The note was still in the Duke's desk. The maid's testimony was still something only she and the Duke knew. Holt was still in this house, moving through it with his organized certainty, preparing the tisane no one in the room was drinking. What she did not know, and what the Duke had arranged that afternoon while she had been setting place cards in the dining room under Lady Alderton's direction, was that Sir Crispin Reeve had not been invited merely as a neighbor. He was the sitting magistrate for 3 counties. He had, that afternoon, reviewed a brief prepared by the Duke's own solicitor from London, who had arrived that morning on the early coach and departed before dinner. The brief contained the maid's account, the note, a record of the trust managed by Holt's brother, a correspondence that had been located in Emmeline's own writing desk in the box room where her personal effects had been stored for 4 years, and a formal request for the magistrate's guidance on the question of what followed next. The dinner was very long and very civil, and Cecily ate her food and spoke when spoken to, and did not think about any of it. After, in the drawing room, the Duke crossed to the window where she was standing, and stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of his sleeve against her arm. He said, quietly, not looking at her, "Reeve will return tomorrow with 2 constables. Holt will be removed from the property. He will not be permitted back inside." She said, "And after?" "After is a longer question." They stood at the window in the posture of 2 people looking at the same dark garden, which required no explanation from anyone watching. She said, "There will be consequences for the brother." "Yes." "Emmeline's trust." "It will be recovered." A pause. It was her own money, her father's provision for her. She had wanted it for a school she had been planning. A village school. Another pause, longer than the first. "I did not know about the school until I found the correspondence." Cecily held very still. "She had 12 children enrolled already," he said. In her mind, she had written them descriptions. Something moved through her that she did not name. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at the garden with the stone face, and the exhaustion beneath it, and the ghost of a smile that had not yet completed itself. "She sounds," Cecily said quietly, "like someone who deserved the money back." He looked at her then, direct and full and close. She felt it in her hands, which were entirely steady, and in her throat, which was not. "Yes," he said. He said nothing else for a moment. Then, after a silence, "I'm sorry you were placed in a house where that was a thing I needed to say." She did not know what to do with that. She looked back at the garden. The following morning, Holt was gone before the household had risen. He had been accompanied by 2 men in Reeve's employ and a written order, and he had gone quietly, which Cecily had not expected, though the Duke had. The Duke said later that a man who operates through surface management rarely has the resource for open resistance. He removes himself neatly or not at all. Lady Alderton received the news in her morning room with the expression of someone who has been given information that rearranges a previously stable set of facts. She did not speak to Cecily that day, or the day after. What came next came slowly, which was the correct pace for it. The Duke asked Cecily to assist with the correspondence connected to Emmeline's trust. It was formal ground, and she moved carefully on it, which was the only way she knew how to move in large houses. She sat in the study across from him, and they worked through the documents, and she asked questions he answered without ceremony, and he asked questions she answered without pretense, and the days shortened, and the fire burned longer in the grate each evening. He did not perform grief. He had been carrying it for 4 years, and it had become part of the structure of him, the way a bone heals after a break. And the healed place is stronger, but never quite the same shape it was before. She could see where it lived in him, in the care he took with particular objects. A small blue glass bottle on the mantelpiece that she did not ask about. A volume of Italian verse he kept on the corner of his desk, and never opened. In the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and waited, as though listening for something that did not come. She had her own versions of this. A father who had died before she could show him that she had managed. The specific register of rooms where she had not been a table. 4 years of understanding that her worth was invisible to the people with the authority to confirm it. They did not speak of these things. They spoke of the documents and the school and the correspondence and the questions that needed answering. They sat on opposite sides of the desk, and the fire moved, and the house around them had the quality of a held breath that was slowly learning how to release. There was a morning when he reached across the desk for a document she was holding, and his hand closed over hers a moment before she released the paper. A moment only. He withdrew his hand. He looked at the document. She looked at the document. Neither of them spoke, and the room was very quiet around the not speaking of it. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, in the late afternoon, she was alone in the library organizing the last of the maps, and he came in without announcement, which had become the way he came into rooms where she was, without announcement, as though they had agreed on something neither of them had said aloud. She heard him behind her and felt him stop at her shoulder's distance, and she did not turn. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the correct thing to say." She set down the map. She turned around. He was close enough that she had to look up, and he was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which she had stopped being surprised by, but had not stopped feeling. "I do not require correct," she said. "I require honest." Something moved across his face. Not the ghost of a smile this time. Something with more warmth in it. "I would like," he said, "to know if you would stay." He stopped. He started again. "Not in the capacity of a companion. I am aware that my mother employs you in that capacity, and that this house has been, in a variety of ways, not what you deserved." He looked at the maps on the table, and then back at her. "I would like to know if you would stay as someone whose presence here is chosen. By both of us." The coal in her chest had been burning for weeks. She felt it now as heat rather than weight. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, and it was sufficient. He reached out and took her hand. Not the accident of papers this time. Deliberate. Careful. His fingers closing around hers with the full intention of a man who has decided something, after a long time of not being sure. His hand was warm. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was not entirely composed, and aware that she did not mind at all that this was true. They stood in the library in the late afternoon light, her hand in his, and did not require anything else from the moment. What followed was not quick. There was a period of arrangement, of formal calls, of Lady Alderton's sustained and visible displeasure, which eventually gave way to a calculation about what was more costly, the displeasure or the opposition. And the calculation resolved itself as calculations in large households usually do. There was a letter to Cecily's only remaining family, a cousin in Wiltshire, who wrote back with warmth, and something close to relief. There was a conversation with Sir Crispin Reeve about the formal proceedings connected to Holt's brother, which would take several months to complete. There was the school. The school was the thing Cecily cared about most, and understood best. She read all of Emmeline's correspondence about it, the 12 children's descriptions, the plans for the building, the curriculum she had imagined. She found a woman in the village who had been a schoolmistress in her youth, and who received the proposal with a brisk practicality that was itself a kind of joy. The building was a converted granary on the edge of the Duke's property, and it took 3 months to make it suitable. The 12 children Emmeline had described were now somewhat older and somewhat different from their descriptions, but they were real, and they came on a January Monday, and they learned their letters by a fire in the room Emmeline had planned in her own hand, and Cecily sat in the back of the room and watched them, and thought about a woman who had sewn a note into a hem, and trusted that someone would find it and do something with what they found. The blue glass bottle on the mantelpiece, she learned eventually, had been Emmeline's, a small perfume bottle she had brought from her father's house when she married. The Duke had kept it on the mantelpiece because he had not known what else to do with things that belonged to someone you had not been able to save. After Christmas, when the house had settled into the particular quiet of a January evening, the fire lit and the snow coming down outside the window in slow, deliberate flakes, Cecily sat beside him and watched the school correspondence organized into a neat stack on the corner of the desk. He had his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, which was the form their evenings had taken, warm and unhurried. She said she would have liked it. The school. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. She would have filled every room with them. The snow came down and the fire moved and the house around them breathed. On the mantelpiece, the blue glass bottle caught the firelight and held it, and Cecily looked at it and thought of a note between two layers of silk, and the particular courage of a woman who had not been able to speak aloud, but had made very sure that the truth would outlive her, sewn into a hem, patient, waiting to be found. She reached out and touched the bottle once, lightly, and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that the small gesture had not already carried. Outside, the snow continued, soft and indifferent and accumulative, covering the grounds of Alderton House in a silence that had nothing of grief in it anymore. Only winter, doing what winter does, making the world briefly clean. If Cecily's story stayed with you tonight, leave a word in the comments for the woman who sewed the note. And thank you for staying until the end. That was what Cecily thought about in the weeks after Holt's removal, when the house began to readjust itself to a different shape. Not about the note, not about the trust, not even about the school, though she thought about all of those. She thought about the courage of a woman who had known she was in danger and had nevertheless taken the time to be precise, to fold the paper correctly, to select the dress, to sew the stitches the right distance apart so that someone's fingers would find them and not mistake them for seam work. She thought about how frightened she must have been. She thought about how she had not let the fright make her careless. Cecily understood something about that. She had been frightened in this house in her own smaller way, not for her life, but for the continuous daily cost of being treated as though her perceptions could not be trusted, as though what she saw when she saw the house clearly was somehow beside the point. Lady Alderton had a way of deploying these costs that was very efficient. Small recalibrations of register and address that accumulated into a pressure as reliable as weather. Cecily had learned to bear them with the patience of someone who has no alternative. She had not learned to stop noticing them. The night after Holt's removal, she could not sleep. She sat at her window in the small hours and looked at the grounds below, and thought about Emmeline, about the 14 months of her marriage, about the school she had been planning, the 12 children. She had given them descriptions, their natures and their interests and their likely difficulties. A girl called Ellen, who would need the letters shown 3 times before they settled. A boy called Thomas, who would do everything faster than anyone expected and need to be given harder work to keep him honest. A child whose name Emmeline had not known yet. She had written only, "There will be a child who comes late in the year, in autumn, who will need the desk nearest the fire, who will come thin and cold and hungry for more than food." Cecily had read that description in the library with the document trembling slightly in her hands, and she had thought that she had known them. She had known them before she met them. She had been preparing to receive them. What kind of love is it, Cecily thought at the window, that survives the person who felt it and goes on doing its work in the world without them? The school was already doing it, The children arriving on Monday mornings with their cold hands and their looks of assessment, and their gradual opening into the room's warmth. They had no way of knowing that the room had been planned for them by a woman who had died 4 years before they sat in it. They simply sat. They simply learned. They simply became, in small increments, more than they had been when they arrived. She could not have said why this particular thought made her want to cry. It did not feel like grief. Not exactly. It felt more like the specific emotion of witnessing something that has survived. The Duke was not a man who performed his grief, but he was a man who felt it, and she had come to understand the difference between those two things in the weeks they worked together at the study desk. The performance of grief is a continuous outward exhibition of loss. The feeling of it is quieter and more fundamental, a reorganization of the interior that never fully reverses itself. He had reorganized. He had done so alone in the 2 years of what the household called his travels, which she understood now had been a form of learning to carry a changed structure without losing his uprightness. He had managed. He was managing. It cost him something, every day, that she could see in the careful set of his face in the mornings and the way it eased, almost imperceptibly, over the course of an evening. She noticed the easing. She thought she was probably the only person in the house who did. Lady Alderton noticed nothing except the failure of her campaign. Mrs. Pemberton withdrew gracefully to her neighboring estate, and Cecily felt no pleasure at this, only a mild relief that the machinery of management had been set aside, and the house could breathe at its natural rate again. Margot, the Lady Alderton's daughter, observed Cecily with the candid assessment of a young woman who has not yet acquired her mother's skill for looking without seeming to, and said once, over breakfast, simply, "You are not what I expected." Cecily said she was not often what people expected, and they left it there. Margot had a directness that Cecily thought, given the right circumstances, might grow into something admirable. The house had other inhabitants, she was learning. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farwell, who had come to Alderton House 6 months after Emmeline's death, and who had always known something was wrong, and had simply not had the evidence. Mrs. Farwell had wept, briefly and in private, when Cecily told her what the note had said. Then she had dried her eyes and said, "Well, and what are we to do about it?" in the tone of a woman who has always known that the doing is the thing, and the weeping is the preface. There was a footman called Jarvis who had a large family in the village, and who had been Emmeline's favorite because he could do a perfect impression of the old Earl of Severnford without trying. There was a kitchen maid who read. Cecily had found her in the scullery passage with a volume of verse tucked inside her apron, reading in the brief quiet between tasks, and had not mentioned it to anyone, and had begun leaving volumes on the shelf at the back of the passage where they could be found without comment. This was the Alderton house that Lady Alderton's management had made invisible, the one Cecily was learning. The proceedings connected to Holt's brother took 6 months to conclude, and Cecily sat in the study through most of them, taking notes, managing the correspondence, occasionally asking questions that the Duke's solicitor from London answered with a faint air of surprise, as though he had not expected the question to be that precise. The Duke said once, after the solicitor had left, that you have a very particular quality of attention, and Cecily said she had always had it, that it was a thing that had never been useful to her until now. He said he found that difficult to believe. She said there were not many houses in the world that required their companions to notice things. He said no, and looked at her with the particular quality of his attention that had become, over months, as familiar as weather. And she looked back at him with her own, and neither of them needed to say anything more. She had not been a woman who expected to be chosen. She had built her life inside that expectation, had organized her competencies around it, had learned to make herself useful in places where usefulness was the only currency she had. It had been a small life in some ways. It had required a certain quality of daily endurance that she had become so accustomed to that she had almost stopped registering it as endurance. She had thought that was simply what her life was. She had not been prepared for this. For a man who listened when she spoke. For a study with a fire and a desk and work that required her actual mind. For an evening in a library with her hand in his, and nothing urgent anywhere in the room. For the feeling, so strange she had turned it over in her chest for days before she trusted it, of being in a place where she was not waiting to be dismissed. The school opened on a January Monday. The children came. The 12 that Emmeline had imagined plus 4 more, and Ellen who needed the letters 3 times, and Thomas who went faster than expected. And in November, just as the cold came in, a child arrived late, sent by a farm family from the edge of the estate, thin and quiet, and given immediately to the desk nearest the fire. Cecily looked at that child, and thought of the description in the letter, and felt the specific shiver of a world accounting for itself, doing the long, slow work of making things right in ways that the people who set them in motion could not wait to see. She was at the back of the room. The Duke was at the door, which he had taken to appearing at on Monday mornings for a quarter hour before his estate business began, standing with his arms folded and watching the room with an expression she had stopped trying to name because it had too many things in it at once. She caught his eye from across the room. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked at the child by the fire, and then he looked back at her, and the ghost of a smile completed itself. She had not been expecting that either. She received it the way she received everything in this new life, with both hands open, and she was not even slightly composed about it. And she did not mind.